Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to a good, crispy morning in beautiful Vancouver. And this is actually our first fall. This is our first fall webinar event. So few housekeeping things. If you can switch off your video and mic, that will be great. But if you want to keep your video on, it's all good too. But definitely switch off your mics. Second thing is, if you have any question, if you can put it in the chat box of your screen, that will be pretty good, and we'll be picking questions. And the way I try to do is just build a story around how we are presenting this event. So we'll be picking the questions as we go. So feel free to ask, and the more questions we have, more value we get out of the session. So really look forward to something interesting over the next 45 minutes. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Pankaj. Great to be here.
Yeah, so why don't you start with tell a little bit about Kobalt, your background. Sure. Why do you think you are so good in what you do? Yeah.
Yeah. So Kobalt is a cybersecurity services company focused on small and mid-sized firms. We've been in business for just shy of 2 years, and we've been working primarily with tech companies across BC, Canada, and North America. You know, I've been in cybersecurity for 20 years. It's a real passion of mine. You know, selling and working with businesses of all different sizes, a lot of global 50s and larger enterprises. And cybersecurity has been really an unsolved problem down in the smaller end of the market. And so our real passion is about solving that problem and addressing cybersecurity needs for small and mid-sized firms. And so we help organizations assess their programs, build them out, and operate so that they can solve their cybersecurity challenges without the need to build expensive teams and staff and solve those problems with internal resources.
So how do you differentiate between, because cybersecurity is a very oftenly used word, how is it different from, I mean, you know, I started or I entered the industry in 1990 or so. What we used to have, number one, it was that not that big an issue that time. It was that if you have antivirus and few things here or there, you're okay.
Yeah.
And how is it different from IT security in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think cybersecurity has become kind of a default name in the industry. I'm not a fan of it in the same way that I'm not really a fan of artificial intelligence and other sorts of kind of catchy marketing phrases, but it's sort of a norm that people have landed around to deal with kind of a general broad term around online threats and attacks. You know, in the early days, as you mentioned, like cybersecurity was mostly around viruses and those sorts of attacks. And, you know, as actors have gotten more sophisticated, attackers, cyber criminals have started building more complex attack forms, cybersecurity has become kind of much more the catchphrase of the day. And so we see attacks not just in terms of malware, but we see targeted compromises, we see social engineering attacks, we see a variety of different kind of forms that, you know, have a much more significant impact on business than ever in the past. One of the things that the criminals have gotten really good at is you know, targeting the financial assets of organizations and having very significant damaging outcomes. Whereas, you know, 20 years ago it was kids in mom's basements, and it was much more kind of fun hacking kind of stuff rather than, you know, serious criminal enterprises. And, you know, just to give you a sense of scale of how big the industry problem is today, the cybersecurity criminal elements bring in more revenue every year than the annual drug trade, right? And so that gives you a sense of just scale and impact to the businesses that are impacted by it.
Yeah, we come across customers who are paying like money to get whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you got
username, password back or whatever. Yeah,
ransomware attacks. You've got, you know, business email fraud where people are, you know, intercepting payments in motion. You've got the classic data breach where people are compromising records and you know, leaking confidential information. So there's a whole variety of different ways people are being attacked these days, and it's getting harder and harder for, you know, smaller teams who don't necessarily have the resources and expertise to defend themselves.
So a typical use case would be, as our clients are moving to the cloud, maybe Azure, AWS, Google, whatever.
Yep.
So let's say data center provides me all the security, etc. I just moved to cloud. So what changes? I still have the same admin and user and whatever. How is it different? So the scenario is, if I am moving to, say, Azure, all my infrastructure has moved there. What are the, like, say, top 3 questions maybe I should ask, or what are the 3 things I should be aware of? Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does. So there's really a few different primary considerations. One of them is like, how are you adopting cloud, right? So it's one thing to adopt cloud on the infrastructure level, right? So I'm considering lifting and shifting out of my own internal data center or a third-party data center into an Azure environment or an AWS environment, right? So that's infrastructure as a service where I'm buying compute and storage and this kind of stuff, kind of basically moving my workloads over to the cloud. So that's one cloud application. The big mistake that people typically make, and this is more of a business level decision, is they move from a secure data center environment where the data center is providing, you know, web application firewalls and DDoS protection and a bunch of other layers, and they move into a fairly bare bones Microsoft or AWS environment where those additional security layers aren't built in. And so they're mismapping the responsibilities of security from one player to the other player, right? And so that creates an additional risk associated with that move. So that's one kind of scenario. Another scenario where I think there's actually a huge opportunity for improved security is people who are moving their applications to the cloud, right? And so, you know, traditionally, if you think about running your own internal Exchange server, right? You know, you got to patch it, you got to keep it up to date, you got to, you know, make sure that you can take advantage of the new features when they roll out, compared to operating on O365, which is constantly kept current, you know, has got native multi-factor authentication, these sorts of things. So applications moved to the cloud, you're actually handing a lot of the security responsibilities over to the application provider, and you know, it can end up with a lot better outcomes if you implement it properly. And
so what should they do? Where to start?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple places to start. So one is really understanding and doing some security architecture work up front when you're doing your cloud adoption, right? So mapping out kind of who has what responsibilities as it relates to the cloud provider versus, you know, your organization versus third parties, right? And so, you know, classically, I mentioned earlier this infrastructure as a service. So there's this concept of a shared responsibility model. Typically, the cloud provider is responsible for the hardware, the physical security of the cloud data centers, the hypervisor, and then the business itself is responsible for, you know, the application stack on top of that, right? So that's kind of one scenario, and you can do some architecture work to say, all right, I need to put some security controls in front of my application stack, right? So I might, you know, put a WAF or, you know, some sort of cloud security controls in addition, right? Another scenario is where you're buying something like a platform as a service. Say you're using a Heroku, for example, right? So in that case, your area of responsibility is actually very narrow because you're just responsible for the code. And so then you have to make sure you're doing code security well, but you don't necessarily need to worry about the top and bottom layers of the infrastructure quite so much. So start with a security architecture that really looks at, you know, who is responsible for what, and then you can map in controls to fill the gaps.
And what about me as a user? So what is that I should demand from my infrastructure providers, like multi-factor authentication? I know you are a big fan. You are leading that initiative. Maybe you can share about that initiative also. I think you've got a lot of signatures now.
Yeah, I think we're about 350 signatures on our way to 500. So I've started an initiative to kind of get the Canadian government to require banks to offer multi-factor authentication for free to consumer accounts and stuff like this. The banks tend to be a little bit laggards as it relates to that particular aspect of security, which is unfortunate. And the banks are seen as a industry leader. And so where the banks are slow, other organizations are slow as well. So multi-factor authentication is one of the best things that individual users can do to help secure their cloud accounts, right? And so for those of you who aren't familiar with it, basically it could be a text message to your phone or an authenticator app. We typically recommend using an authenticator app. It's a one-time code, so that in addition to your username and password, you have to enter this code when you access that site. And the real reason I'm such a proponent of multi-factor authentication is that it reduces account compromises by over 99%, right? It's not a silver bullet, but it's as close as a silver bullet as you can get as it relates to individual account protection. And so, you know, we encourage you to use multi-factor authentication wherever you can. But the three critical things that I talk about a lot are your email accounts, right? So this is your Office 365, your G Suite, right? Because your email accounts are kind of the key to everything else inside of your kind of life online, right? So all your other accounts tend to do password resets and stuff to your email account. The second would be your cloud credentials, right? So if you think about your Azure, your AWS administrators, they should be using multi-factor authentication whenever they're authenticating into your cloud platforms. So again, that reduces the risk of those core assets. And the third is your code repositories. Again, your developers, if their accounts are compromised and those code repositories are compromised, that can lead to downstream impact on your infrastructure. And so again, protect that with multi-factor authentication. That could be GitHub or Azure DevOps, those sorts of things. And so, those are the three, but generally you want to implement multi-factor authentication wherever you can. And once you've implemented it in one place, it's pretty easy to add others, and you've got the app on your phone.
So let me, you are called many times when there is something which has happened. I think that's where you get a lot of your business. If something has gone wrong, people want to get the vaccine for the next time.
Yeah.
And tell me an example which you think was the most, interesting is the wrong word to say, but yeah, maybe last 12 months. I know one example which I'm associated with that firm as a stakeholder, where the email, the bank account, somebody changed and suddenly the $200,000 went to a different account.
Yeah. So there's been a few attacks specifically recently where we've seen an issue where an account from an executive was compromised because of a credential stuffing attack. And so the way credential stuffing attacks work is, say, Pankaj, you're not using a LastPass or 1Password. You're not using something that has a unique password for every website. In us being us, we tend to be lazy, and so we reuse our password in a bunch of different sites. And so one of those sites gets compromised, and the attackers then take that username and password and spray it everywhere they can to see what else they can get access to. And so we've seen a couple instances where that led to access to the executive's email account, and then that email account is compromised, and all the data held within that email account is therefore available to the attacker. So if you think about everything you email back and forth over the course of 6 months, it could be, if you're an executive, it could be personnel records, client information, all this kind of stuff. All of that was, leaked and, represented a threat and a risk that, easily could have been dealt with stronger account security, right? So that's one scenario. Another scenario that we saw was $150,000 transfer that was intercepted. And so there was a communication between a client and a supplier, and one of the accounts of one of those individuals had been compromised over an extended period of time. And say that we're talking back and forth about a contract, and then in the middle of that communication, because the attacker had persistent access to that email thread, they inserted a special message that said, hey, we've changed our bank because our previous bank was under audit. Here's where you transfer the payment to. And they had registered a very similar lookalike domain and had $150,000 transferred and siphoned away within minutes. Wow. And so fortunately in that case, we were able to confirm that the attack had occurred and given them evidence, and they were able to get to the bank and get the money recovered. Fortunately, one of the things that we try to do is actually help our customers be proactive, so they're not fighting fire so much as kind of preventing them from getting out of hand in the first place.
Yeah, so actually that's a good segue into my next question, is more of the proactive thing.
Yeah.
Like we used to, and I don't know security much, but like ethical hacking or advanced penetration testing when we develop applications, etc. Those proactive things, do they help or?
They absolutely help, right? So penetration testing is a great way to make sure that your application is secure. It's less likely to be compromised by an attacker. So we do penetration testing against your cloud applications and also your infrastructure. Yeah. Awareness training is one of the most cost-effective things that you can do with your staff, right? So if you think about it, your staff are your kind of first line and your last line of defense. And so they're constantly receiving emails and threats and attacks. And so if they just know not to click on it or to report it to IT if something does happen, then you can reduce the risk of an incident actually occurring in the first place. Security monitoring is another big one for us, which is us being able to see all the events across an organization's infrastructure and see early signs of risk and attack before they become more serious. And so that's a very good investment that a lot of organizations can make to reduce the risk of something getting out of hand.
Actually, before we go deeper into the security questions, maybe can you cover a little bit of, this is off the main topic, but about the privacy? Mm-hmm. And because more and more questions we are, particularly on cloud, where data resides, data residency, PC, Privacy Act, and some of those things. So maybe some cue on how or what to do about it, yeah?
Yeah, so privacy is a very large topic, especially here in British Columbia, because we have very specific regulations around privacy and residency of data, right? So we have protections that say, basically, you're not supposed to move BC resident data outside of Canada without explicit permission and consent. And the reality is, like most organizations that are working with BC citizen data are doing this on a regular basis. It's just making sure that they understand, follow the law, and gain consent. The key thing to understand about privacy is you need to make sure that the user understands what you are doing with the data, that you have explicitly documented that, and you're gaining consent when they sign up to your applications and these sorts of things. The government ends up being much more restricted because they can't force users to use a service where their data is being stored south of the border and stuff like this. A lot of this comes out of fear of the U.S. Patriot Act and the fact that the government in the United States can basically go into service providers in the U.S. and take citizen data without really a lot of controls in place. And so that's really actually slowed down a lot of cloud adoption, especially in the public sector here in British Columbia. And so, we do, privacy impact assessments and kind of privacy reviews for clients to help them understand, are they doing things properly, making sure that they're gaining the right kind of consent, they've got the right type of documentation. Again, for most private enterprises, it's not so much an issue of what you can do, it's just making sure that you're documenting and gaining proper permissions. But privacy is a big problem because, organizations leak data all the time, they get compromised, and that has a lot of impact. The big kind of thing that's been a big shadow over the whole industry is the GDPR in Europe, where the fines associated with privacy violations can be up to 4% of organizations' global annual turnover. And so that's where we've seen Google and others pay billions of dollars in fines. Architect and design security in from the ground up, right? And so I'm a big proponent of cloud. I think it has a lot of benefits, but it's one of those things where people make a lot of mistakes as well. And so I talked earlier about the mistake that organizations often make around this shared responsibility model and not knowing who's responsible for what. There's two other classes of mistakes that I think organizations make a lot. So one of them is kind of what I would refer to as DevOps type mistakes, where you implement the cloud and you inappropriately open up permissions to information. And so I'll give a specific kind of, hopefully not too technical example. You're building a new application and you've got a data bucket, right? And you're troubleshooting how the data bucket communicates with your compute resources. And so, since you're having problems getting them connected, you open up permissions to the world when you're doing that. Yep. And then you forget to close it off later on. That's a really common kind of mistake. And this is, anybody who, has been a technical person or a sysadmin over years, like usually when you're troubleshooting, you kind of open things up and then in theory, you go back later and close them down. And so in reality, in the cloud world, often this happens in the same way. People open things up when they're troubleshooting a problem and they forget to close it back down, and then it causes, public access to private data that shouldn't be allowed. So that's a really common class of mistake as well. But generally speaking, proper implementation, having good partners can really help you lock down your cloud so that it's actually more secure than what you would have in the data center. And the building blocks that we have in the cloud are very robust, right? And so they allow us to do a lot of really good things with security.
And anything to add on the hybrid environments? Hybrid is basically where you have something in your data center as well as public cloud, because more and more we are seing
hybrid environments. Yeah.
Does it make it more complex, or?
I personally think that hybrid environments do make it more complex. Okay. I think it's a resource issue as it relates to organizations. So if you're a large enterprise, you probably have the IT teams and DevOps resources to do both at the same time. But say you're a 100-person shop here in Vancouver, you probably don't have enough resource and expertise to be really good at data center and really good at cloud at the same time. And so my general recommendation is, if you're making the migration to the cloud, you should try to make the migration entirely as fast as you can so that you can focus your resources and expertise in that final destination. Because trying to do both at the same time means that your skill levels end up being depleted, and it's hard to do both well.
So many of our clients, they by default assume that if Optimus is managing their IT infrastructure or cloud infrastructure, by default, security is taken care of. And it's like many times we don't ask a lot of questions, they don't ask that, and it's an assumed thing. So what's the best way to, so you are saying that should be done at the time of assessment or
yeah, so there's
adoption?
There's typically kind of like two different parts to this. So one of them is the security architecture at the time of design. So when you're planning out your cloud migration, plan it out so that you understand kind of all the different controls and stuff that you need to have in place, and you're fully costing that as well, right? So that's a design side, and then there's a test prior to go live and an implementation. That's the pen tests and other sorts of work. This isn't just a Optimus question and issue. It's a general IT service provider issue. IT service providers are really good at uptime, availability, those kind of core operational requirements, but they typically aren't deep security experts.
Absolutely.
Right? And so that's where often we get called in to say, hey, help us assess our IT MSP, make sure that they're implementing this correctly, maybe provide some additional monitoring and stuff like that on the security side specifically, because it is a different area of expertise. And so, we're very actively involved in helping organizations assess their IT service providers and making sure that they're doing what is expected from a security best practices perspective, but also then supporting that in stage 2 operations.
So let's move a little bit to basically what's happening is in like interconnected world of all software talking to each other through APIs, and there are so many now open, what used to be traditionally open ports or whatever, but now the software, you're talking to so many other applications.
Yeah.
And does that bring another level of complexity in security? Because
it does.
Multiple entry points, yeah?
Yeah, it does. And so kind of the way I would, in a technical way, summarize what you're talking about is there's a shift within the cloud from kind of large monolithic type services to what we call microservices architectures, right? And so this is both microservices and also serverless infrastructure. The great thing about microservices and serverless is that you can narrowly define the service so it only operates exactly what you need it to. So if you think about a traditional server deployment, you might be installing a Windows server, right? And you take your Windows server, you install it out of the box, and you run your application on top of that, and it's got all sorts of unnecessary open default ports, services, and stuff like that that cause problems and security risk down the road. Whereas with microservices, it's like I only need to run Apache or IIS or Nginx, and it's only listening on this port, and it's only doing these things. So I can define my surface area of attack a lot smaller. Yeah. And so microservices implementations can actually be a lot more secure when done properly. Yeah. But it does move the challenges around as it relates to what am I securing and how am I securing it? I have to think about things at the API layer rather than at the network boundary layer.
Good. So yeah, if you have any questions, I've covered some questions, but if you have more questions, please feel free to send our way. And because we are almost midway in our webinar. Yeah, so that looks good. So let's come to e-commerce for a minute, because we do a lot of work on e-commerce side. So any insights there? Because many e-commerce sites, in fact, if I remember my Amazon account, I don't think I have a just username, password, and password. You start shopping. Is that?
That's really common on e-commerce sites. Most e-commerce sites don't have.
So who takes the liability then, like if things go sideways?
It's usually the e-commerce site that eats that fraud. Okay. And so, one of the things I've worked with a number of e-commerce retailers that they're running into are these credential stuffing attacks that I mentioned earlier, where another third-party site is compromised, and then people will try to log in with those credentials across an e-commerce site and then make fake orders, right? And so, online fraud is actually a very significant problem for e-commerce. We see a lot of brute force attacks and stuff like that, where they're trying to attack usernames and passwords, and so that they can buy high value products and get them picked up at the store by mules and sold. And so a lot of e-commerce sites really struggle with that kind of compromise and liability. Usually it doesn't come back to the consumer, but it's still a pain for the consumer. It's like, hey, I got $4,000 charged on my credit card. This wasn't me, and there's a whole kind of negotiation process that consumers have to go through. So again, our recommendations are, even if you can't support multi-factor authentication, make sure that you are using strong and unique passwords at all these different sites, so that if the social networking site that you were using gets compromised, it doesn't result in your Amazon account being compromised at the same time.
So let's go to some practical tips. If I'm the CIO or CFO of an organization, I don't know where I am.
Right.
Correct. So I have say 50 or 100 servers, some in cloud, some in back of the table, some with a hosted data center. I use a lot of credit cards. I have, I mean, typical, all the messy scenario which most of the organizations have.
Yeah, you've grown organically, you've got a little bit here, a little bit there.
Yeah, suddenly I feel in the next 6 months I want to be
more secure
or absolutely secure. So obviously one is we should call you, but other than that, I mean, where to start?
Yeah. So where we typically start with organizations is we do a security program gap assessment. So we look at your entire organization across a variety of different areas, like, are you doing awareness training? Do you have the right kind of controls in place? Do you have the right kind of monitoring? And then we help you build out a map of where you're strong and where you're weak based on the risks that your organization is most likely to face. And so a lot of organizations don't necessarily have the internal competencies to run one of those gap assessments, but if you do, typically what you do is you'll pick a standard, right? CIS top 20, ISO, NIST, that kind of thing, and you do a review of what you have compared to that standard, and it helps you understand where you're strong and where you're weak. And the reason that's important is, what I find is most organizations, when you look at their security programs, they've overinvested in specific areas and underinvested in others, right? So they've bought the greatest and latest next generation firewall for $50,000, but they don't want anybody looking at the alerts that come off of it, right? They've got, maybe they've implemented multi-factor authentication in a bunch of places, but they don't do any awareness training with their users, right? One of the things that we see really commonly in dev shops is they think their developers are the smartest people on the planet, so nobody runs antivirus anywhere, right? And the reality is that they're getting infected and they don't really realize it. And so, doing a broad program review really helps an organization understand where they're strong, where they're weak, especially as it relates to the attacks that they're most concerned about. Could be a data breach, could be ransomware, but that way you can really understand kind of where your deficiencies lie.
So one good question actually, and actually one of the clients sent me an email yesterday. So they have they said we have just got a message from Google or that we have say 250,000 files and folders, and out of that 150,000 have been shared with external people. So is it an intrusion which has happened? I said, no, I don't think so. That's there. So they are putting whatever their analytics. But the question is really, how do you know an intrusion has taken place? What are the early
indicators?
Indicators, yeah.
Yeah, that's a challenging problem for a lot of organizations.
Yeah.
This is why security monitoring is actually so important.
Yeah.
Is for most organizations, they don't actually have the ability to have visibility as to what's going on within their environment, right? And so, they don't know that an intrusion has occurred until some third party finds their data leaked out on the dark web and tells them, or the credit card manufacturers start coming back to them and saying, hey, we're seeing a pattern of fraud abuse that we can trace back to you as a retailer, right? And so that's why security monitoring and compromise assessments can actually help to determine whether or not an intrusion has occurred. That being said, there's a lot of kind of early indicators. So one of them is, your network perimeter devices will often see communications occurring if you have infected hosts, right? So an example would be, if your laptop gets infected with malware, often it'll have to communicate back home to another kind of command and control server to determine that, to get new instructions. So there's things that we can look for on the network that actually help us determine an intrusion has occurred. But that's why we do security monitoring as a service. It's very, very difficult for a lot of companies to build that capability internally until they get to a certain size team.
Yeah, what I find surprising is, and you and I were chatting it before the session, is sectors where really information should be super secure, like schools where it's information about kids, etc., banks, and some of them, they seem to be or even I'll say not-for-profits where they have a lot of data about a lot of sensitive issues, and they seem to be the least secure.
Yeah, I actually, I'd say not-for-profits and schools definitely struggle. Banks are generally, other than my personal bone with multi-factor authentication, banks actually generally do a very good job of security. I'd like them to do better on account security. A lot of it is just focus and resources, right? So if you're a 20-person not-for-profit, you probably don't even have an IT person, let alone a security person. So then how do you get good at securing all this data that you're collecting? There are more and more service providers that make that easy. So instead of building and managing your own infrastructure, again, choosing to use the right cloud providers can help make your data more secure, right? And so a good example of this is in health tech, right? The individual clinics maybe aren't so good, but if they're using a good clinic software that's got good security principles baked in that can help secure the data more effectively than trying to run their own server, for example.
So you have another question. Let's go a little deeper into the technical side, the DevSec Ops.
Yes.
So what are your thoughts and what are the common mistakes people make? I mean, you touched a little bit on the DevOps side, but you think it's a good idea to have like a DevSec Ops as one offering?
Absolutely. I think the biggest challenge for DevSecOps is talent shortage, right? So if you think about, it's hard for you to find great DevOps people. It's hard for you to find great security people. Finding a great DevSecOps resource is kind of looking for a unicorn because they have to have all that development operations experience as well as that security experience, right? And so there's definitely a shortage of resource in the industry of, people who are modern on stack and security. And so that's definitely an area where we try to focus on helping customers. So then the question becomes, well, how do I build those competencies, right?
Yeah.
And so usually what it's similar to how we built security companies generally earlier on, which is we invest in individuals who are interested in security and develop them through training, right? And so you pick the 2 or 3 people on your DevOps team and you make them specifically responsible for DevSecOps as part of their sprints and development cycle, right? So you get them through some development security training, you run them through programs, that becomes part of how you build those competencies. And so it's definitely a journey. It's not something you just you don't just give somebody a DevSecOps title and all of a sudden the problem is solved. But that being said, it is a solvable problem if you invest in your people.
Yeah, so his question is also around if you're outsourcing your DevSecOps, what are the things you should be?
Yeah. So if you're outsourcing,
basically, what are the metrics or what are the outcomes we should look at?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a few things that are really important. One of them is making sure that your DevSecOps resources have good familiarity with the stack that you're particularly working with, right? And so, if you're an Azure environment, making sure that they've got good Azure expertise, that they're working with other Azure clients. This isn't the first time they're doing Azure, because DevSecOps on Azure is different than DevSecOps on AWS or GCP, for example, right? So that's one thing. Another thing is it's not usually very effective to hire a traditional security person who tends to be more network centric for a DevSecOps role. You need people who actually have development and code background, because a lot of the vulnerabilities and issues are more code related than infrastructure related. So, those are 2 things specifically, like make sure that they're familiar on your stack and make sure that they actually come from a development background, not just a security background, that can really help you qualify a candidate.
So yeah, that actually brings me to the next question on the resources. So the traditional security engineers or network security engineers, how easy it is for them to move to this new way of cybersecurity, cloud security, infrastructure, etc. Is it a very tough journey, or because a lot of it is at code level rather than firewalls and all that?
I mean, I think it depends on the individual, right? I mean, most of us who are in information security or cybersecurity are in it because we're passionate about learning. It's an industry that changes fast all the time. That being said, if they come from a code and dev background, I programmed a lot early in my career, so even if I'm not an active developer now, I have a good enough understanding of kind of where the common issues and mistakes and problems are that I can be versatile in that space. And then recognize that you're going to have to continuously invest, right, in that individual, and that individual has to be the sort of person who wants to continue to invest in their skills, right? And so, where I see this struggle a lot is, in public sector where you have somebody who's in a union job where maybe they have been doing the same thing for 10 years and they don't want their job to change too much. That's probably less of the profile of a person who's somebody who, is constantly upping their skills and taking new courses and trying to keep up the cutting edge, right? So you want to look for a profile of a person who is trying to maintain and develop their skills and keep them at the forefront all the time.
Yeah. So let's, that question comes often with COVID and people working from home.
Yeah.
How has that changed the complete cybersecurity scenario, or people who are working from home even earlier, but your thoughts?
Yeah, I see kind of 2 scenarios. Like, one is for organizations, like a lot of our customers, they're tech companies. And so working from home is not much different from where they were working before. They were pretty mobile, and this is pretty much the same as usual for them. But for a lot of traditional businesses where it was primarily office bound and organizations could rely on the security controls in the office, that's been a real difficult transition, right? So if you think about you're in the office and you can walk over and talk to a coworker if you get a suspicious email, you're behind a firewall, so you have a bunch of protections. and you take that person and you put them at home, and you don't know how their home environment is set up. And so we've rolled out training, for example, that helps people understand like what they should be doing to secure their home networks, and helps organizations understand what they need to be doing to support their people at home, right? And so we have seen a significant rise in attacks in the COVID world, taking advantage of the fact that people are much more susceptible to social engineering attacks and CEO fraud and stuff like that, because it's harder for me to walk over and talk to you to validate that that email is legitimate, right? And so you have to think about, how do I keep the lines of communication open and make sure that people know to be a little bit more suspicious of all these communications they're receiving and validate whether or not something is legitimate before they fall victim to attacks.
So another question, actually we'll take that one and then maybe do the bit of summary, is when you develop the software, basically the question is, should you have the built-in updates for all the security, etc., or you should have more of a manual update because there's a efficiency and cost and software speed and all those issues,
I mean, really, built-in auto updates are the way to go, right? If you think about software that's deployed to laptops and workstations and stuff like that. In a cloud environment, interestingly, what we don't do is update our ephemeral instances, our kind of virtual machines. Instead, what we do is we automatically redeploy rapidly, right? So if you think about an environment where you've got 100 virtual machines that are being controlled by code using a Kubernetes cluster or something like this, I don't want to go and patch a machine that's in production in flight. Basically, what I want to do is update the core image and then redeploy it. And that's actually a really effective way to deal with updates. And so software in the cloud is built with this kind of, sheep not cattle, cattle not pets kind of thing, where I'm killing things off and respawning them so that they're secure. And the nice thing about that is it's a lot harder for an attacker to gain a footprint and spread, because nothing lives that long. And so, but generally what you want to do is you want to make it so that things are updating automatically all the time. One of the great things about cloud security and cloud application security is, if you think about an application that you might run in-house, well, that's 1,000 administrators that have to go out and update that server when you have a software update. Whereas if I'm in a cloud environment, I update my core infrastructure and everybody gets the benefit of that security update. So automatic updates all the time is definitely the way to go.
So let me read this question, it's a little long. So you talked about being as fast as possible with a cloud transition, though the issue I have battled with over the last number of years is that each service migration has faced unique issue. So if we try to be basically quick every time, we may compromise on security, etc. So is there an opportunity to pace and make sure that we take a smaller steps?
There's a trade-off there, right? And so I think the trade-off is, the longer you live in a hybrid environment, the longer you have a long-term skills gap and risk, right? But you're right in that you want to make sure that you're making the migration in a sound and secure way, right? So we talked earlier about security architecture. And so the way I would look at it is, you should think of it as much of as a big bang project where you leave as few things behind rather than something that you do over a 2 or 3 year cycle, right? So the faster you can get most of your stuff to the cloud, the better off your organization is going to be overall, as long as you're taking the right approach to get there.
Yes, I think the second part of the question was a little more interesting, where he says, how do you basically impact of security on my business? So how do I do that impact analysis, that if this happens, this is how my business will get
compromised?
And actually I have a related question which I was going to ask you was, so let's say bring some optimism to the whole thing. So what happens when an organization gets seriously breached? How do you bring life back to normal? Is it some like 1-800 number you call, or what happens?
We help organizations with compromises and breaches all the time. The reality is, I think of breaches like traffic accidents. They're things that happen, right? Like, you can try to prevent every breach in your organization, but that's going to slow you down to a point of not being able to be agile and nimble in your business. And so security is a balancing act. And so the approach we take with a lot of our customers, we build a risk register where we analyze the impact and the probability of a particular type of attack and breach occurring. And we help them focus their investment on the things that are going to be the biggest impact and the most likely to occur, rather than just trying to deal with security across the board, right? So, you can really build security into your infrastructure, your ecosystem, your culture without sacrificing your speed and agility. It just needs to be done thoughtfully. And most organizations survive breaches as long as they have taken appropriate preparatory steps, right? So, one of the things that we help customers with are incident response plans and tabletop exercises. Understanding how a breach is going to impact your organization before it occurs dramatically reduces the cost of that breach when it occurs, right? And so there's some things that you can do to really lower your costs overall.
Yeah. So, any parting thoughts? Anything which you think?
Yeah, I guess my parting thought on security is a journey for all of us. I've been in the industry for 20 years. I'm constantly learning. The joke that I always like to share is the things that I learned 20 years ago are no longer true. The things that I learned 15 years ago are no longer true. Security is a constantly evolving landscape. Know that we're all on this journey together. We're out there to support our organizations and our customers in being successful. And it's okay that nobody's perfect. We have significant attackers that are out there trying to compromise our finances and our data. But that you can make reasonable investments early on that are going to have long-term dividends in terms of your overall risk profile. And we'd be happy to help any of you that are interested in that.
So one more question, since we have actually, it's an interesting one, is most of the attacks, are they really, what is the percentage which will be some disgruntled employee, some internal developer, etc.? Does that happen very often, or?
Insider attacks are unfortunately fairly common. They tend to be more common inside larger organizations than smaller organizations. Smaller organizations, you typically have a tighter culture where everybody's really kind of pulling in the same direction. Yeah. Larger organizations are often targeted for insider attacks, right? And so we've seen situations where attackers have actually written large checks to insiders in order to gain internal access to be able to do a more effective attack. So some combination of insider and external party is often involved. So it is something that occurs. I think if you're a small business, you just want to make sure you're doing the right things. But if you're a large business, it's something that you need to actually effectively invest in controls around.
So can you summarize, the last thing is the top 3 things which either as a consumer or as a business user or an IT person I should do just to low-hanging, basically.
Low-hanging fruit. As I mentioned, I'm a huge fan of multi-factor authentication. It's one of those things that's not a silver bullet, but does dramatically reduce the risk of account compromise. And combining that with like a password manager as a consumer is another really good thing. So you're using unique passwords on all these different websites and stuff like that. And a third one is, running up-to-date and current anti-malware software, right? Unfortunately, malware is still a really common attack vector, and it can really reduce your risk.
Thanks, and we are exactly at 9:45. So thanks a lot, everyone. Really great session. Thanks a lot, Michael. Obviously, Michael and I have known each other for many years, and we are doing a lot of interesting things together. So I think you'll see more coming from us. And if you have actually any more questions, feel free to send them our way, and Michael and his team will be more than happy to answer them. And stay tuned for our next webinar. We'll have some interesting one coming in November. And have a great day.
Yeah, thanks very much. Stay secure.